Welcome to the Great War Discussion Group. It is the last day of February, and I think it's the last day of February, and we are hearing from Mike Burke. As most of you know, pretty much everything that we see today is influenced by what happened during and at the end of World War I. Even up to and including the headlines about the war in Ukraine, which at the time was known as variously as parts of Russia and Galicia. Now, of all of the areas that have been influenced for the long term and in many ways for the worse by World War I, the Middle East is probably what most people think of first, and with reason, because much of what is going on in the Middle East is a direct result of things that happened during World War I. So in order to try to help us make some sense out of all of this, Mike Burke has studied the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which France and England agreed to provide themselves with protectorates, colonies, and spheres of influence in the Middle East in what used to be the Ottoman Empire. So Mike, go ahead.
All right, thank you very much, Charlie. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for joining me here today. As Charlie said, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It's an arbitrary decision taken by people thousands of miles away from the actual territory that had, as Charlie said, long-reaching effects, both immediately after the war and then, as Charlie said, even to today, right? And so Sykes-Picot Treaty essentially is, by most historians, is identified as the most prominent case of imperial double dealing by the British Empire. There were actually three agreements that existed, one in 15, one in 17, and then the Sykes-Picot in 1916. But the Arabs were very explicit about not wanting the French involved in anything going on in the Middle East or in the Arabian Peninsula. And the Sykes-Picot essentially brought the French in, and the Arabs were really quite upset about that. As I mentioned, the other two agreements was a 1915 correspondence between the Sharif Hussein and a British government minister named MacMahon. And essentially what the Arabs agreed to do was to attack Turkish forces in the Arabian Peninsula in return for British guidance and British direction, and the possibility that the British held out to creating an independent Arab state after the war. And then the second agreement, or the second negotiation, we'll say, is the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which is relatively famous as well, at which time the British government in principle agreed that the Jews should be allowed to return to and establish their homeland in the Palestine. Interestingly, they did that for a couple of reasons. One is that the prime minister was actually pro-Jewish, pro-Zionist, and he was looking at to kind of take care of those interests. The second was that they were trying to influence the Jewish population in neutral countries, i.e. United States, for assistance in helping to support the war effort. And then because the Balfour decision occurs after the Russian Revolution, most of the folks who overthrew the Russian government were Russian Jews. So they were appealing to the Russian Jews or Jewry across the world in support of that. Obviously, they didn't bring the Arabs into that discussion, the Palestinians, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that arise from that. But that's kind of where I'm at. And so for those who aren't familiar with what the Sykes-Picot Agreement looks like, it essentially set up areas of influence as well as control. And even though it was between between the British and the French, they also had to get Italian and Russian agreement with that. I'll talk about that in some greater depth a little bit later on. This is my agenda for today. We'll kind of go through all of those. I'm not sure about you. I'm not sure when you first heard about the Sykes-Picot Agreement, but for me, it was the 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia, specifically in that scene where Prince Faisal turns to General Allenby and Monsieur Dryden and mentions a secret agreement that has been agreed upon, and they're going to go ahead to live with it. And this occurs during the meeting prior to 1918, where the Arabs are going to go ahead, the Arab revolt's going to go ahead and help the British move on and take Damascus. But again, for me, that was really the first time, though they didn't call it Sykes-Picot. For me, that's really the first time that I'm aware of that. Well, I became aware of that agreement. If this discussion was being held in 1914, and we were all up on international and foreign relations, one of the things that we probably would have talked about, or might be talking about today, was what was called the sick man of Europe. Now, the term sick man of Europe was coined by a British diplomat named John Russell in 1853 during the lead up to the Crimea War. And he actually gives credit to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who used that term in a discussion with Mr. Russell. And I'll quote what Tsar Nicholas said was, "The Ottoman Empire is a sick man, a very sick man, a man who has fallen into a state of decrepitude, and a sick man who is gravely ill." And this turn of phrase, this sick man of Europe, continues to exist all the way through up to the beginning and through the First World War. And so we would be talking about the sick man of Europe, or we'd be talking about the Eastern question, and specifically, what is going to happen to all of that territory that belongs to the Ottoman Turkish Empire. I'm going to talk a little bit detail about the Ottoman Turkish Empire and how it grew and then shrunk. But by 1914, the Turks really are only controlling what is present-day Turkey, the Middle East to Iran, Iraq, and then into the Arabian Peninsula. And what our concern is what happens when they fall apart. And it's going to be driven by three factors. The first one is, who's involved in what's going on in and around the diminishing Ottoman Turkish Empire. And then that really is the five major empires that exist at this time. Great Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia are all part of the groups of people who are chiseling away at the outskirts or on the enclaves of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So all five of those empires are going to be involved in what happens after the Ottoman Turkish Empire disappears. The second reason why is both Austria-Hungary and Russia have very large multi-nationality empires. And the rise of modern nationalism is affecting them as well. And they're concerned about how are they going to take care of the territories that they now occupy or they control. And as we obviously know, for Austria-Hungary, Serbia is of major concern to them. And then the last thing, how are they going to do it? How are these empires going to be involved? It's that secret agreement, or the secret alliances that we talk about sometimes that occur. England, France, and Russia have lined up against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And attack on one, to paraphrase the NATO terminology, is attack on another. And so anybody who's interested in foreign affairs, international relations at this time are going to be concerned about what happens to the Ottoman Turkish Empire. And I think most of you are familiar with all of this and that has come to a fore, but is kind of captured quite neatly in a comment by Chancellor Bismarck in 1888, where he says, and I quote, "One day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans." And as we all know, he was right. All right, a little bit about the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So in existence for over 600 years, over 600 years. Begins around 1299 in what's present-day Turkey, Anatolia, and over time begins to expand. As we're all well aware of, it expands into North Africa. It expands down on east and west of the Red Sea, down to Ethiopia, over to Yemen, back into the Middle East, into present-day Iran and Iraq. And then it began to push all the way up into eastern portion or the Eastern Europe. And Turkish expansion will continue until 1683, where for the first time a coalition between the Holy Roman Empire and the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth will defeat Turkish forces that are besieging Vienna. And 1683 marks the high point of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. After that, they begin to slowly but surely lose territory. And if you look at the red dot on the left-hand side, that's where they are in 1512. And if you look on the dot on the right-hand side, they've kind of been cut back down to, that's what they were in 1914. You can see that over time, their empire has really shrunk, and they are truly a sick man in Europe. Slide on the right talks a little bit about when their territory, they begin losing territory in the 19th century. Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt. Egypt's actually the first to go when Napoleon takes it in 1793, and then again a little bit later in 1882. They lose territory to Greece during the Greek War of Independence. They lose a little bit of the Bosnian area to Russia, and it's going to really be the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913 that are going to push. They're going to push the Turks back to a much smaller area. In the early 1900s, there was, I think everyone's familiar with the term the Young Turks, right? So due to this loss, the shrinkage, this loss of prestige and the loss of territory, there's this movement to replace the Sultan. The government itself is very corrupt. A lot of military officers are concerned about the future. And so under Enver Pasha, they will eventually not overthrow the government, but they'll reduce the power of the Sultanate, and they will elect or form a national assembly that represents all of the people. As soon as that occurs in 1908, immediately they begin to reach out for military assistance. And so they will reach out to the Germans. The Germans will respond by sending a military delegation in 1911. That's going to help them reorganize their army. The other thing that Enver Pasha did is he retired 1,100 senior military officers who were advanced in age and not willing to go fight. So he's trying to build this professional military. They're in the process of reforming the military when the Balkan Wars occur. They suffer really quite badly during the Balkan Wars. And in 1913, a second military mission goes to Turkey to go ahead and assist with building up and developing their army. Unfortunately, the assassination of the Archduke, followed by the negotiations, and war occurs in 1914, quite frankly, a little bit sooner than the Turks would probably have preferred to have it, given the fact that they were still in a process of reorganization. And I think two things. One is that the Germans convinced the Turks to adopt the triangular organization that we're most familiar with. Each corps has 3 divisions, each division has 3 regiments, each regiment has 3 battalions. And so that's kind of the organization that Turkey takes into the Balkan Wars, and then again into the First World War. I guess it should be no surprise that Turkey comes in on the side of the Central Powers. One, because of the military missions and the influence that the Germans have with Enver Pasha and the government. They actually sign on with the Central Powers on 4th of August, 1914, but it doesn't become public knowledge until October of 1914, when the 2 German vessels, the 2 warships that Germany provides them, actually sail into the Black Sea and attack Russian ports in the Black Sea. At which point, everybody kind of knows that, hey, I guess the Ottoman Turkish Empire is now fighting with the Central Powers. All right, I'll pause. Want to catch my breath too, see if there are any questions. Again, if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat. Now, hopefully I can pick them up, see them, and we'll go ahead and answer them as we go along. Let's talk a little bit militarily about the major players. And so first ones will be the Turkish army. I've already talked about the reorganization, the Young Turks and all of that. When the Germans began to reorganize with the army, they did like what most advisors would do. They kind of took a look at the organization. They took a look at the strength. They took a look at the weapon systems. And for the most part, the Turkish army really wasn't in bad shape. They could, at the beginning of the war, muster about 2 million men, which was a pretty reasonable sized military for this period of time. That army was made up of folks from across the empire, so you'll have Arabs as well as mainland Turkish folks. They did suffer from problems with artillery. They had French, Austro-Hungarian, and German field pieces. And if you're a sustainer, really about artillery pieces, kind of difficult if you're having to buy from your opponents, right? So they'll be short about 200 guns, 250 guns at the beginning of the war. Machine guns are also a problem. They've got some modern machine guns, but not enough for their table of organization and TO&E, organizational allowance. So they're going to go into the war kind of short of machine guns. They're going to kind of go to war short with ammunition. Turkish soldiers will carry about 150 rounds with them when they go into battle. Unfortunately, they've got another 200 million rounds that are stored back at the Corps headquarters. And the last one, for the most part, they have bigger. I mean, their bigger issues besides organization and fielding it was the fact that their sustainment process wasn't very good, right? Specifically in the Arabian Peninsula, those and it's brought obviously brought to mind when you look at the movie, but those garrisons that are in the Arabian Peninsula are resupplied by trains, which kind of run the rails throughout the desert, which are highly interceptable to or vulnerable to the Arabs as they move across the desert. So overall, you could say that the Turkish military was relatively well prepared. They actually have a very poor record with regards to attacks. Most of the times that they went on the attack, they didn't do as well. They obviously did much better job in defending, i.e. draw your attention to Gallipoli and what they did to the Commonwealth forces in Gallipoli. But overall, you can say for the most part, they had good leadership for the most part. They had soldiers, when the soldiers were motivated, they did really well, but they suffered from an inability to really sustain the force. And that's going to cripple them a little bit later on, especially in the Arab Peninsula. Next folks up are the Arabs. The rise of pan-nationalism occurs in the area just to the east, the Levant area, in about 1820. And so Arabs in this time frame are asking for not necessarily independence, but for a little bit more involvement in what happens to them. I think if you're familiar with the Ottoman Turkish Empire, for the most part, they allowed local rulers to manage things with the ethnic groups under their control. And as long as they paid their taxes and provided soldiers for the military, the Turkish government in Ankara could care less how they managed their business. But that kind of comes to a change. The idea of pan-Arabism, and so really what the Arabs are asking for are a little bit more of a say-so in how they manage their situation. They want Arabic added to the educational program, and they really want is the Arab conscripts who are going into the Turkish military to stay in the Arabian Peninsula. The Ottoman Turks were a little bit concerned about what side the Arab soldiers would fight on, so most of the Arab soldiers all went north and fought in the northern campaigns against the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians. Against the Russians, and not so much in the Arab Peninsula. The Arab Revolt, or the Great Arab Revolt, begins around 1916. After that 1915 correspondence between the Sharif and the British government, and you begin to see their army or their military forces being formed. The force itself is kind of made up of two groups. If you remember the movie, the photograph in the upper right, you've got the Bedouins who are on their camels traveling across the desert and attacking isolated British compounds. And then the other part of their army was Arab soldiers who had fought for the Turkish army, but who had been captured as POWs. And they fought more as a conventional force attached to the British army. We'll talk about that, or the Egyptian expeditionary forces, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then obviously, if you look at the folks in the photograph here in the bottom, Prince Faisal and Lawrence of Arabia, when Lawrence finds out about the Sykes-Picot Treaty, he is incensed, he's angry, he is felt that he's been betrayed by his government, because he had promised Faisal, and he really meant it at the time, that they would have a say-so in forming their own governments, and the British government would stand behind them. As a matter of fact, Lawrence was so angry that when he was called to meet with the king King George V was going to give him his knighthood, he refused to meet with the king, saying that you have betrayed me and I'm not going to accept the knighthood that you're offering me. When the war ends, he convinced Prince Faisal that he should participate in the 1919 peace conference in an effort to get England, or at least the Allies, to live up to the promises that they made in those three agreements that I talked about a little bit more. Faisal goes to England. He does meet with some leaders there. Lawrence becomes his escort, essentially. The Foreign Office essentially asks Lawrence to be Faisal's interpreter and guide. And so Faisal and Lawrence will work side by side during the 1919 peace agreements in an effort to try to regain some of the independence that they believed they were owed as a result of the various agreements. Next up are the French. As we well know, France is very active in West Africa and North Africa in the West, in its colonies, Morocco and Algeria, and over into Tunis. At the beginning of the war, during the war, they actually have no territories, no colonies in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but they're going to ask for those territories that I've highlighted there, essentially for three reasons. The first is protection of the Christians who are living in Lebanon and Syria. The second one is they believe they'll get them access to the Arabian Peninsula, oil in the Arabian Peninsula. And the last, essentially, the third reason is to kind of act as a buffer, trying to keep the Brits from controlling all of this territory. So I think that's probably the reason why the French were brought in on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And then last but not least, obviously, are the Brits, right? So Britain has a long history of engagement in the Middle East, going back to 1500 or 1600s. Their traders, the merchants will travel along the east, all the way to the eastern part of the Mediterranean. They will establish trading agreements with the Turkish Empire. They'll be able to go ahead and trade goods back and forth. Over time, they begin to travel. A lot of English folks will travel to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Those folks will write stories, they write poetry. You get to get a better understanding. I mean, England begins to get a better understanding of the Middle East. By the 19th century, England is really concerned now about protecting its interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. They're concerned about protecting the sea lines of communication to India, their largest colony. And they really are interested in keeping Turkey around for a little bit longer. Again, as I mentioned earlier, to serve as a buffer between England and Russia, because Russia had interests in Afghanistan and they're interested potentially in India. Militarily, essentially, when the war begins, there's some Allied or British forces are in Egypt. I think I might have mentioned it when I talked about the war in sub-Saharan Africa, but there'll be English soldiers, there'll be soldiers from India. Some of the commanders will be Indian from the British Army in India. Some of the commanders will be British from the British Army in Egypt. It kind of leads to one of the reasons why the Gallipoli campaign didn't turn out the way they wanted to, because you had two sets of commanders there. And that was called the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. And in 1915, Gallipoli's not, like I said, didn't work out very well. The MEF returns to Egypt. So all the Indians, all the Australians, all the New Zealanders, all the Brits return back to Egypt, where essentially they spend 1916 and the early part of 1917 protecting the Suez Canal, which obviously is the connection between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, then on into the Indian Ocean. In 1917, the British commander will launch a series of attacks against the Turks in an effort to kind of push them out of the Arabian Peninsula, out of the Sinai. Those attacks fail miserably, and so the forces retreat back into England, and General Murray is relieved and replaced by General the guy who we saw, Allenby, the guy who we saw in the Ocean Creek. All right. So, sorry, General Allenby is going to take over in 1917. Essentially, he's going to rearm, refit, retrain the Egyptian expeditionary forces. And by 1918, they're going to be prepared to go ahead and begin offensive operations that will start in the spring and kind of move its way up in the Sinai, up into the Arabian Peninsula. And by October of 1918, the combined forces of the British and the Arab revolt will seize and take Damascus, essentially ending that part of the campaign. One of the things I noticed in one of my things I read was that, and you don't really see this in the movie as much, but the bulk of that EEF, the Expeditionary Forces, were actually Indian soldiers or sepoys that were left over from the Gallipoli campaign, along with the Arabs and the other British soldiers and the Australians and New Zealanders. So militarily, those are the forces that we're talking about. So let's take a break and take a look at the two authors. And so Sir Mark Tatton Benevito Sykes, as it says here, he's all of those things. His father was a baronet, very well established. As a child, his father took Sykes traveling throughout the Middle East and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. As a young man, he becomes interested in that. When he turns 18, he joins the British Army, actually fights in the Second Boer War, 1899, begins to meet people, i.e. future politicians, future prime ministers. When his father passes, he's elected to Parliament, and his first speech before Parliament in 1911 talked about what British foreign policy in the Middle East should be. And so clearly he is an individual who's has education, has knowledge, practical experience, and is thinking about the Middle East. When the war begins, he's the commander of a battalion in the Green Howards. Unfortunately, he does not go to war with them in 1914 because the foreign minister, Lord Kitchener, Secretary of War, and other members of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs realized that he's better off serving them in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And so he is brought in. He kind of heads up their intelligence section. It's Sykes who, as an intelligence officer, advises the British government that the Turks will not come in on the side of the Allies, that the Turks are actually going to go in on the side of the Central Powers. So he's the one who, based on his analysis, lets the British government know that. Kind of another interesting point that I found is he's the one who designed the flag for the Arab revolt. And if you look at that flag that for the Arab revolt, that essentially has become the basic flag for 7 other Arab nations. And so, again, that's credit to him for his involvement in designing that particular flag. Based on his experience, based on his knowledge, he's selected by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to represent England in the negotiations with France in order to come up with an agreement about how they're going to go ahead and carve up the Middle East. And as slides said, that agreement is finalized in January of 16, and eventually the British government ratifies that on the 9th of May. And again, secret, nobody knows about it except the Italians and the Russians. Klepp Coasthold. And at war's end, he's obviously as a member of the driving member of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with regards to the Middle East. He's going to go to Paris, where, as it says on the end, he's going to contract the issue with Spanish influenza, and he will pass. And so he dies in Paris. The French portion is Monsieur Georges Pico. Interesting enough, really not a whole lot written about Mr. Pico. He is the son of a famous French historian, Georges Picot. He's the grand uncle of a former French president. Begins life as a lawyer. Actually begins working in Paris, but he only does that for about 2 years before he decides he wants to be a diplomat. One of his first postings is he goes to Beirut, and then when the war begins, he's sent to Cairo to represent French interests there. I guess he must have been the most knowledgeable Frenchman at the time, because he was selected by the French government to represent France in this negotiation. After the war, you can see there he serves across the world and eventually becomes the ambassador to Argentina. And as I said, I was really kind of surprised to find out that really not a whole lot of information about him, what he did afterwards, what he did during, kind of a mystery. Or I just couldn't find the right source. Sorry. All right, so that's who the major players are. That's who the principal authors are. let's talk about the situation, then we'll move on into the agreement itself. So the situation, pretty well, I think everybody can agree, it's a very complicated situation. And the reason it's complicated, I think I've alluded to, or at least mentioned to it a little bit earlier on. Everybody is interested in what happens to the former Ottoman Turkish Empire. Everyone is interested in sea lines of communication. Everyone is interested in oil. Everyone is interested in blocking the movement of other empires into and out of that area. And so, again, Russia lays claims to some of that territory. Greece lay claim to some islands. Italy lays claims to part of the Aegean. France obviously wants to go ahead and take care of what's going on with their territory. And England wants to keep what they've got. And so everyone has their interests. Interesting then why it's just the French and the British that are talking about this, and they later bring in the Italian and the Russians, probably because it would have been a much more difficult discussion if you'd brought all of the major powers in. But eventually they're going to go ahead and knock out the Sykes-Picot Agreement and handle what they think is the best solution to the particular situation that we have with regards to the downfall of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. As Crystal asked, and we talked about, it was a secret agreement. When the Russian government fell after the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks let the world know that was going on, and that raised a little bit of an issue for Britain and France with regards to enacting a lot of the things that they wanted to put into the agreement. So that's the situation, kind of busy. And here's the agreement. So essentially what Sykes said was, he laid the map out on the table, like the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, where they carved up Africa. They laid a map on the table, and Sykes says, I want a line drawn from the E in Accra to the K in Kirkuk. And everything below that line belongs to England, and everything above that line belongs to France. And so an arbitrary line drawn on a map where, without concern to the people that are living there, the cultures that are living there, all of that situation, that line is just drawn, and everything arbitrarily goes under the influence of the French, British, a little bit later on, the Italians and the Russians. I think the arbitrariness of this decision, the fact that nobody was brought into consultations for this, kind of will set us up for a lot of the issues that we're going to see here in just a little bit. When talking about the agreement, a lot of people talk about in terms of history. The line didn't care. Again, the line carves up the territory. They don't really care where the people are. They don't really care who's there. Most of these people had wanted to have independence. They wanted to be free of Ottoman Turks, the Turks. They wanted to have their own governments. England and France come in and essentially say, look, we don't really care what you want. You're now our protector. You now are under our wing. You're going to kind of do what it is that we want you to do. So a lot of that, the hostility, a lot of the trouble that we see today kind of comes from, I think, from this arbitrariness of the line that is set here. All right, so we talk about effects in terms of history. We already talked about that. They kind of disregard the history of the people there. They're going to run roughshod over them. Their interests are obviously self-interest. England is interested in what's good for England, mostly the oil and control over the people. France is going to be interested in what's going on with regards to its access to oil, as well as protecting the Christians that are there as well. And they, again, really don't pay much attention to the identity of the people that are living in the region. And I think that, again, we'll come back and we'll talk about that in the next section. So what then are just some of the issues that we could tie back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty of 1916. The first one is the Turkish War of Independence. So the Allies begin occupying Turkish territory by October of 1918, essentially. They overthrow the government that was there. They put in place a pro-Allied government. They form a national assembly. The folks in Turkey are really quite angry about that. And under the guidance of Ataturk, or Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, they're going to go ahead and form their own separate government or their own separate assembly, and they're going to begin to start fighting against the occupying powers. And so the actual treaty that gets Turkey out of the war is called the Mondros Armistice, and that was again in October of 1918, at which point the Allies start occupying the Turkish mainland, for lack of a better word. Again, the Turks aren't happy with that, so they begin military operations against everybody who is currently occupying Turkish territory. And so there'll be a series of conflicts, and I'm going to refer back to my notes to make sure I don't misstate them. But by 1920, the pro-Turkish assembly is established, and Mustafa Kemal is appointed as the leader and the military general. They're going to go ahead and begin their offensive operations. The Allies are going to make an agreement with the pro-Allied government called the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920. And then obviously the Kemal and the nationalist government are going to go ahead and not recognize that and continue the fight against that. There's going to be an agreement. They're going to kind of knock Armenia out of the conflict in December of 1920 with the Gümrük Agreement. They're going to go ahead and take the Russians out of the picture as a result of conflict with the Treaty of Moscow in 1921. They're going to further alienate, or not alienate, but Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia will be out of the picture by 1921. Greek forces will be out by the fall of 1921. And French forces essentially will be out of the Turkish area in the Ankara Agreement of 1921. So really now they're faced with just really is British influence and to what's going on with there. There's another agreement in 1922, which essentially gives them a little bit more freedom, a little bit more ability to manage what's going on. And in November 1st of 1922, they essentially abolished the caliphate, they abolished the sultanate, or they abolished the sultanate in 1922. And then after the Lausanne Peace Treaty of 1923, in 1924, they'll actually eliminate the caliphate. So the caliphate, which had been in existence for almost 600 years, will be terminated in 1924. And a little bit later, when we talk about terrorist organizations' motivation for some of the terrorist organizations that we see in the Middle East is reestablishment of the caliphate. And so we have a modern Turkey by 1922, caliphate gone by 1924. And Turkey will really be the first central power, member of the Central Powers, who will actually break free from the restrictions placed on it by the armistice from 1918. Whereas obviously, Germany and also Hungary will have to pay reparations for many, many years. Sorry, just realized I didn't read whether or not the Turks had to pay reparations to the Allies. Maybe they did, maybe they don't. Sorry, stray thought, my apologies. Next one kind of goes back to the establishment of the Balfour Declaration of 1917. So when the war ends, they're going to go ahead and establish a protectorate. It's going to be set up by the British and the French. Obviously, the Arabs who are living there are not very happy about the situation. They expected to be granted their own territory. The Zionists who are there, they're expecting to have their own territory. And essentially, the Brits are stuck with keeping the peace there for a very long period of time. There was occasional conflict. There was the 1936-1939 Arab revolt in Palestine, where the Arabs revolted against the Brits as well as against the Zionists who were there. And then in 1944, towards the end of the Second World War, the Zionists will begin to attack the British, trying to force them out, which they eventually do by 1948. So on May 14th, 1948, Israel declares itself as an independent state. And as we all know, Harry Truman, then President of the United States, is the first leader to go ahead and recognize Israel as a state. Obviously, that didn't sit well with the Arabs, and we get the War of Independence. But for me anyway, I think we could argue about this a little bit later on. You can look at it. I mean, the most conflict that we have in the modern world really has been centered around Israel, right? The creation of the Israel state and the conflict that occurs between them. So this one just kind of talks about You have external war, where the Arab states surrounding Israel attempt, I think, 3 times to go ahead and erase Israel. They're unsuccessful. The Palestinians inside of Israel start the Intifada, or a civil unrest. Remember what happened during the first Gulf War, where we essentially provided missiles to go ahead and knock down incoming Scuds from Iraq, in which they did quite well. And they've even gone to war with Lebanon a couple of times, right? First and second wars. And then Hamas, which is a terrorist organization, essentially launched attacks against the state of Israel in the years that are indicated there. So clearly an area that has seen a lot of conflict. With a lot of conflict comes a lot of UN peacekeeping missions. So you can see some of them, like that last one, has been there since 1978. That's the force, peacekeeping force that's located in Lebanon. And then when you have UN missions, you also have peace treaties. And so there's been a lot of peace accords. And so everyone's familiar with the ones that we, the United States, helped broker between Egypt and Israel, and then later with Israel and Jordan. And then just the 2020, we helped negotiate the arrangement between Israel, Sudan, UAE, and Bahrain. But I think hard-pressed to find any other territory in the world that has seen as much conflict, which I think you can directly relate back to the Sykes-Picot, the end of the First World War. Again, my opinion. Next one are the Kurds, right? So the Kurds, or Kurdistan, is first mentioned back in the 5th century BC, right? So it sat along, Kurdistan outlined here in the purple, sat along the line routes between Africa and the Middle East, between Europe and the Middle East. They had their own governments, their own territory. For the most part, they were fairly independent until they were eventually taken over by the surrounding governments. The Kurds really took to heart the points of Wilson's 14 points, where self-determination was important. So as the war ends, essentially the Kurds say, well, we should be like the Arabs, we should be like the Zionists, we should be like other people who are getting their independence. And they began asking for that. Unfortunately, when Turkey becomes a state in 1924, the Turks are going to have nothing with that. We're not going to take anything, we're not going to allow that to happen. And so the Kurds are the largest group of people in the Middle East that do not have their own homeland. They are separated between 5 or 6 different countries. They have asked for assistance from the West. For the most part, the West has not paid much attention to that because of the national interest that we have with the countries involved in the region. They have fought for their own independence. The PKK in Turkey is a Kurdish insurgent that's attempting to gain and take over territory. And then I kind of thought it was interesting that even though one of the things that come out of the First World War is chemical weapons, and obviously they were outlawed in 1928, but that doesn't seem to stop the people in charge in the Middle East. You had Iraq gassed their Kurds in 1988. The Turks are brought up before the court for a chemical attack that they conducted in 2021, just last year. And Syria, the use of chemical weapons from the 2013, 14, 15, and 18. So again, another legacy of the First World War is the use of chemical weapons against, in this case, the Kurdish people in their requests for desires for independence. And then the last group that I was going to talk about were terrorist organizations. So again, Middle East, tremendous amount of conflict since the end of the First World War. You also have a tremendous number of terrorist organizations, right? And so first up is Hezbollah, which is a Shiite Muslim political party, actually. So it actually is part of the government of Lebanon. Came to fruition at the end of the 15-year Lebanese civil war. It is definitely anti-Israeli, backed by the Iranians. It's where they get most of their weapons and their support, and actually has been involved in the Syrian civil war that's been going on since 2013. So that's one. Hamas, Palestinian, vehemently anti-Israeli, also supported by the Iranian government. their influence or their attacks on Israelis wax and wane over time. I think currently they're really not as big of a problem as they have been in the past. They are kind of the opposite of the second party in Israel, which is Fatah. And Fatah signed a treaty of non-aggression with Israel, so they're the more peaceful of the two organizations that are inside of Israel. But both of them are dedicated, or at least Hamas is dedicated to the eradication of the Israeli state. Al Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula kind of was formed in 2019 as a merger between Al Qaeda in Yemen and the larger Al Qaeda that was active at the time. It's a Sunni Islamist group, and essentially what their goals are is to overthrow the Saudi Arabian government and establish a caliphate in that portion of the Arabian Peninsula. They're actually receiving support from a lot of different places. And about 2 years ago, they launched a major offensive against the Saudi Arabian government, which the Saudi Arabian government responded with an offensive operation that caused a lot of casualties. And then just last year, our administration essentially said that we were no longer going to support Saudi Arabia in their effort to defeat AQ in the Arabian Peninsula, that the Saudis were kind of on their own. And we closed our embassy in 2015, so we really have very limited access to what's going on in Yemen at this time. The other one is the Al Nusra Front. Now, that is a group that essentially is an AQ inspired. It's also supported by Iran, and its goal is to overthrow Bashir, kick out all of the Westerners, and to establish a caliphate in the territory that's known as that's in Syria right now. They were supported by ISIL, or the Islamic State of the Levant. However, as we well know, the ISIL or ISIS was militarily defeated in 2015. So essentially, a lot of support that they're getting is coming from Iran, I think. And the next one is the ISIL, or the one that we're most known with, is ISIS. Established about breaks from Al Qaeda in 2014. Essentially, established the caliphate in the western portion of Iran. All of the allies joined together to go ahead and defeat that. They were kind of militarily defeated by 2015, I want to say, and essentially they no longer, 2020. Sorry, they no longer occupy the territory that they formerly occupied. Have kind of gone to ground. They do still continue to move a little bit of money from one point to the other. Again, I'm not a terrorist expert, not really an expert on the Middle East, but what I thought was interesting, it's a slide from an old presentation that we used to give, was during its heyday, ISIS provided support to a lot of terrorist organizations that were located inside and outside of the Middle East. And so this slide is kind of busy. I'll give you a chance to take a look at it. But ISIS was supporting terrorist organizations in Asia, in Africa, obviously in the Middle East. Interesting thing, when ISIS was defeated militarily, a lot of these organizations, once they no longer received money or support from ISIS, kind of went back to what their original ideology was. So while they didn't renounce ISIS, but they kind of cut back on their verbal support anyway. But ISIS, again, one of the larger terrorist organizations out of the Middle East, reestablishing the caliphate, all of that kind of left over from the First World War. So let's talk about in conclusion. So some historians, and you can argue with them if we want to, really do believe that the war begins and ends coming out of the Ottoman Turkish Empire of the Middle East, right? It's a Serbian national seeking independence from Austria-Hungary who assassinates the Archduke, thus leading to the beginning of the First World War. And it's the Treaty of Service, it's the Treaty in 1922 that establishes an independent Turkey, is really the last action that occurs during or as a result of the First World War. Now, we can argue that. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it kind of makes a point that the Ottoman Turkish Empire, the old sick man of Europe, definitely played a major part in what went on during the First World War, and certainly plays a major part in what's going on in the world today. So with that, let me show you my references. And there's a tremendous amount of material written about not only the Sykes-Picot Treaty itself, but also the results of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. If you go on a lot of different websites, and the Middle Eastern ones, they talk about that. Now, second page, again, a fair number of documents written in turn. And with that, I will take a break, open it for questions, and I thank you for your kind attention.
Very good. If you have questions, just take yourself off mute or push your space bar, and that'll do it for you.
So as you're thinking of your questions, what you see here is the bottom left is the Turkish army prior to the First World War, and that above that is the soldiers of the Arab Revolt. Upper right is the Kurds that are fighting in the eastern portion of Turkey, and the bottom photograph is the Turkish response. That's from last year when the Turks gassed the Kurds in the western part of Turkey.
All right. Well, Mike, thank you very much for all of that. That was a great presentation, and we will look forward to hearing from you in the future about other topics. I think this is perhaps the most confusing part of the whole post-World War I legacy, but it's hardly the only one.
Thank you. That was my pleasure.